Cool it was to hear about Di and Ore, two of those two Credo graduates from a few years ago. Now we're on. I've got it. In the blind men and the elephant fable, only the storyteller can see what the blind men are describing is actually an elephant. And I've been using the fable as an analogy to try to help us to grasp what is happening in Revelation, particularly these middle chapters, 6 to 16, that God is the only ultimate storyteller. And without revealing the full elephant to us, because we're still human, limited humans after all, God is unveiling to us unseen realities, bigger dimensions and enemies we don't always perceive as enemies. Now, all analogies break down at some point, don't they? They can't illustrate every part of the truth with potency. And so now I'm going to come clean with you on that. Firstly, all the blind men in the fable are wrong, of course, but they're nicely wrong. It's a kid's fable. How sweet. He thinks the leg is a tree. That's cute. So here's a slightly different version of the fable, a bit more gory and a bit more real, probably. One of the blind men is hanging off the tail of the elephant and swinging back and forwards as if it's a bungee. Another is trying to cut off the ear of the elephant to use as his personal blanket. And a third is damming up the hose to store water for his own bath later. Now, this darker version of the fable is probably actually closer to what we've been seeing in the last few weeks in our Revelation series. That humans are stuck in their sin and their limits, and they bring judgment upon themselves. The earth revolts with ecological decay, and humanity turns upon itself in wars. In other words, we've seen the last few weeks that the darker fable, the more accurate analogy, kind of has a second chapter to it. The blind start fighting with each other over rights to use the tail as a swing and the ears as blankets and the trunks as dams. And the elephant itself starts to kick and maul the blind men so that they might realize that they're interacting with an animal and not something inanimate. And now today, we get to Revelation chapters 14 to 16. We approach a climactic section of my modified fable, a final judgment. It depicts an end to the chaos in the fable, an overturning of human pride and false worship, a setting to rights of all the injustice and spiritual folly. In these chapters, we're getting a more global or final view of what will happen ultimately in the story. The hour of judgment has come, 14 verse 7. But unlike previous judgments in Revelation, in verse 10, we read God's fury has this time been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. And so when we come to the next cycle of sevens, in chapters 15 and 16, 7 sort of censers or bowls, they are described as the last. For with them, the wrath of God is completed. And then as you read chapters 15 and 16, which I ask you to go and do, and compare the 7 bowls of judgment in chapter 16 with the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets of the earlier chapters, you can see the difference is the former ones, there's partial, a third of the crops, a third of the stars and so on, versus total destruction with the 7 bowls. This is the stark, somber message of these chapters, that God will draw a line one day and say, no more. But even stranger to our modern ears is that this is called an eternal gospel. Gospel, of course, could be translated as good news. Particularly living in the West, where God's job, if he exists at all, is not to be a cosmic judge. That's horrible. That's authoritarian. No, rather God is to be like a therapist, there to serve me, to listen to and to soothe my stresses and to affirm my individual wishes and choices. But the Bible consistently sees God's judgment as both necessary and good, since we know as humans, deep down, that we totally need a judge who is wise enough and powerful enough to do the right thing, taking all factors into consideration and without any undue bias and corruption. That's God. However, that's not human courts. All human courts fail at some point, and no one who has experienced injustice in this life finds their judgments satisfying ultimately. In fact, human justice, even when executed fairly reasonably, still leaves most people unsatisfied. We need an ultimate judgment to settle matters, to put things right. Now, going to extreme examples, as you know, has weaknesses as a method, but at least they surface for us what we might be willing to accept as true. So, for those of us here who struggle with the concept of a final judgment by God, or what in systematic theology is termed hell, let me ask you to consider some extreme examples. How good is it to know that Hitler won't get away with punishment for 6 million Joes, countless gypsies and gays, and all manner of other people that he orchestrated killing, like German confessing church leaders who opposed him? Drinking poison to escape human punishment doesn't mean Hitler will escape ultimate judgment by God. Here's another one. What about the clergy abuses? A couple of years ago, I was talking to one of my avowedly atheist friends, and I asked her if she thought that God was angry with the church for such things. And whoa, did I get an answer. I can't repeat the words she said here in response. But it showed not only that deep down that she thought God might exist after all, but that he was right to be angry, or at least angry about some things. And I agreed with her. The Bible tells us so. It would be better to have a millstone tied around you and you thrown into the deep, says Jesus, than to mistreat a child, a little one, says Jesus. Now, to be clear, judgment is not the best part of the gospel, the good news. That is depicted as salvation in Jesus. We saw that in the first part of chapter 14. Standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion are 144,000 male Jewish virgins, a representative number and a symbolic characterization of all people, Old and New Covenant, male and female, those who've been married or single, all who are saved by God from his wrath through Jesus. Now, why standing on Mount Zion with Jesus the Lamb is so good to describe salvation, or how the symbolism works, I won't get into now, but I'm happy to respond to questions if you write them in the talkback form. And I'm going to finish soon with a section from chapter 15 describing the best part of the good news as well, the song of salvation. But even so, God's judgment is part of the good news. In fact, salvation and judgment aren't unrelated in the Bible as if they're two separate things. Salvation always comes through judgment in the Bible. And the rest of chapter 14, which we didn't get to read, you see an image of a harvest. Now, harvest time in agrarian cultures are always exciting. And overall, they're good. They're good times because it's the culmination of a long season of growing and hard work. But as well as the fruit, there is also the waste of harvest, the chaff, and so on. Jesus described in Matthew 13 the final harvest of God as a separating of the wheat from the weeds for destruction. See, salvation and judgment. And the second image of the harvest at the end of chapter 14 is a harrowing, harrowing depiction of God's final judgment. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar. The altar is where the persecuted and martyrs are, and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of 1,600 stadia. 1,600 stadia, again, a representative number, a symbolic thing of all the earth, 4 by 4 by 10 by 10. Folks, hell is real, and that is a good thing. But you don't want to be there. I don't want you to be there. Actually, maybe some people do want to be there. I'll come back to that shortly. Some key learnings out of this section, as brief as I've been given. Revelation keeps going, of course, after these chapters, and we'll pick it up after Stu back. Today is just a climax in terms of what we might call the negative side of the good news when it comes to humans. We still need to find out what happens to corrupt political powers and deceptive ideologies, who are like beasts preying upon the earth, of course, as well as the dragon itself. And after, we're doing the Where is God in COVID talks next week, but we'll pick up Revelation again after Stu back, and we'll also see a more extensive depiction of what we might term the positive side of the good news for humans at the book's end. But for now, let me make some summaries about what we learned from these chapters. 2 points, firstly, in terms of the series title. 1, we've seen today that the storyteller is not remote or indifferent to the elephant, and not remote and indifferent to the blind men in the story that he is telling. To go back to the fable analogy. In actual fact, God is the owner of the elephant, and the blind men are his servants. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. God is the owner, not just a remote storyteller. Secondly, so in fact, the storyteller will intervene to end the folly of the blind man and the agony of the elephant. Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Secondly then, leaving behind the analogy of the fable now, let's draw some learnings from these chapters about this final judgment of God on humans, or hell. I have 3 clarifications here. Next slide, please. Firstly, notice that while we do have unseen spiritual enemies in Revelation imagery, it's the dragon and all his demons, it's evil realities beyond us which deceive the human race and so on. In other words, things we've looked at the last 2 weeks. Notice carefully that these chapters don't exonerate human agency because of that. Being deceived does not take away human guilt. I mentioned Hitler and clergy abusers before as extreme examples, but in Revelation terms, they're probably in the category of beasts, at least in an idealist way of reading Revelation that I've told you that I'm using. In other words, Revelation is fully aware that some people are far more corrupted and wicked than others. And God, as the ultimate judge, will deal fairly with that spectrum in the human behavior. But hell is not the destination for the worst case scenario of humans. based on relative conduct to other humans. No. It is based on completely different criteria. It's based on human response to God. And that is the significance, you see, of the two types of branding that people have on their heads that John sees in the vision. These are not literal things. The mark of the beast is not carrying a vaccine passport or some other wacky things that you are hearing these days. These are a way for John, as he sees his vision, to easily tell in the vision who is saved and who isn't, because they're marked, because they depict realities of the heart. The saved are those who have the Lamb's name and that of the Father's name written on their foreheads, verse 1. The judged are those, verse 11, who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads. Secondly, notice that while God is the final judge, and actively so, in other words, hell is not just a natural consequence of human decision-making, as some emphasize. Even still, there is an important sense in which there will be no one in hell who doesn't want to be there. I said before that hell is not where you want to be. But in fact, in the sections of the 7 bowls, the final plagues of chapter 16, there are repeated refrains indicating that people are still raging against God in judgment. 16 verse 9 says, they were seared by the intense heat and they cursed the name of God who had control over these plagues, but they refused to repent and glorify him. And verse 11 and verse 21 in the same chapter say similar things. So when Jesus says repeatedly of hell that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth in hell, it's very, very likely that that expression is not expressing sorrow, regret, anguish. No, it's expressing rage and contempt for God. Third and last, having mentioned Jesus' teaching, let me remind you that the person who talks the most in the Bible about hell is none other than Jesus, the most loving, gentle, and compassionate person that ever lived. So take his mindset on board. If you're someone who wishes this wasn't part of the biblical truth, recognize that not fudging on the reality of final judgment is probably one of the most humble things you can ever do. Let me say that again. Not fudging on the reality of final judgment is probably one of the most humble things you can ever do. See, if only really bad or pretty bad people go to hell, then heaven is full of moderately better people, isn't it? And that system, that way of thinking, makes you very arrogant pretty quickly. I am better than others. I don't deserve hell. But as Jesus knew, heaven is full of really bad people. People who might deserve hell, which he repeatedly warned of, but who've been saved from that destination by God's grace. And Jesus gave himself up to the hell of judgment under God's wrath on a cross to substitute himself for those whom he came to serve. And that's the even better part of the good news, salvation. But you can't have the best part of the good news without its complement, its corollary, just judgment. So, as I said, let me finish with another picture of salvation from these final chapters. The saved sing the song of the Lamb. Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. And while this is the song of the saved, let me say that God's holiness and love and glory and his righteous acts that they're singing about, though they are revealed in different ways and to different people, They are both revealed in salvation and in judgment. So please, please ask God to write his name and the name of the Lamb into you, friends. Do not receive the mark of the beast. Do not give up worshipping anything else but God and the Lamb. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, for that amazing talk. It's good to hear the last one about Revelation, and then hearing about hell, which can be a scary thing to think about, but also is really good to be informed